Okay, so this is our ongoing discussion of Simon Dohn's Individuation in the Light of Notions of Form and Information. We're still on Chapter 1 of, or actually, sorry, we're going to be starting, I think that should be Chapter 2, though it says 3 here on the page, but Chapter 2 of Part 1, Part 2 of the book. We're still talking about vital individuation. So last week we finished the previous chapter where we were looking at the relationship between the colony forms of these various organisms and the degree to which we can ascribe individuality to these organisms. So particularly organisms that have this colony structure, so that what we would want to identify as an individual is in some ways not individuated like an individual mammal or bird or something is. So these various invertebrates, sponges and corals and hydras and things like that, they have this colony form where multiple quasi-individuals have a shared circulatory system, or they share various functions with each other, and so there are different degrees of individuation of the total colony as well. So in the case of sponges, the colony just sort of grows more or less haphazardly, except that it preserves a certain overall shape. So there's something that sort of governs the growth of the individual sponges that make up the colony in such a way that they preserve the shape of the colony as a whole. But that's sort of the only structure that's imposed on the growth of the colony. And then in the case of other organisms, you have more structured colonies. So there was one type of, I think it was a kind of worm or something that, clavulins, I have no idea exactly what that is, but it's some sort of aquatic organism. Their colonies are always in a cross shape because there's always 4 new individuals that form through budding, while the inner ones die out, and then the 4 individuals around the outside survive, and then they bud and reproduce, and so the colony grows in a cross shape. So in this case, the colony is more structured and so has more individuality than in the case of the sponge colony that just has a sort of general shape. And then the last bit, he introduces this, he sort of just mentions it in passing or doesn't really develop this thought, but he talks about the way that corals have this branching structure, which, as the term branching indicates, we can compare to the structure of tree branches or plant branching structures in general, even though, of course, corals and plants are very distant from each other in the evolutionary chain or a tree of life. And then he also mentions that the structure of a train of thought or the association of ideas has a similar type of branching structure. And so there's a sort of shared schema of growth that occurs in corals, in tree branches, and also in the train of thought or the association of ideas. So that's just sort of mentioned in passing, but this general idea of like a schema of growth that can be generated in different contexts, I think is a very interesting one. But yeah, it's not really developed, so it's sort of an aside. But yeah, so that's more or less where we are from last week. So we can start on the next chapter. I don't know if maybe someone could check the numbering while we get started, because it says 3 on the translation, but in my French copy it says chapter 2. So I'm not sure if this is actually chapter 2 or chapter, I think it's chapter 2, because I don't remember another chapter break in this part of the book so far. But yeah, we can check that afterwards.
It looks like there was a 2 before this on page 180.
Oh, okay. Interesting. I wonder why there's different chapter numbering in the French edition. But yeah, I can take a look at that later and see if I can figure out what the difference is. Yeah, so let's start on this chapter, possibly 3, Information and Vital Individuation. I'll read the first page or so of this subsection. entitled Individuation and Regimes of Information. A question can then be posed that is perhaps more formal than profound, since it can only be answered by a recasting of commonplace concepts. Does colonial budding consist in an excessively proportioned, simple growth of a single individual? Does it, on the contrary, give birth to distinct yet interlinked individuals? In a word, what is an individual? We respond to this question that we cannot rigorously speak of the individual, but of individuation. We must come back to the activity, to the genesis, instead of attempting to grasp the fully formed being in order to discover the criteria by means of which we will know whether or not it is an individual. The individual is not a being, but an act, and the being is an individual as an agent of this act of individuation through which it appears and exists. Individuality is an aspect of generation, is explained by the genesis of a being, and consists in the perpetuation of this genesis. The individual is that which has been individuated and continues to be individuated. It is the transductive relation of an activity, both result and agent, the consistency and coherence of this activity through which it has been constituted and through which it constitutes. The individual is hereditary substance, according to Rabault's expression, since it transmits the activity that it has received. It is what makes this activity pass through time in a condensed form as information. It stores, transforms, reactualizes, and carries out the schema that has constituted it. It propagates the schema by individuating. The individual is the result of a formation. It is an exhaustive recapitulation and can reproduce a vast ensemble. The existence of the individual is this operation of amplifying transfer. This is why the individual is always in a double and amphibological relation with what precedes it and what follows it. Growth is the simplest and most fundamental of these operations of transfer that establish individuality. The individual condenses information, transports it, and then modulates a new milieu. The individual assimilates a genesis and in turn carries it out. When the nervous system is sufficiently developed, this genesis can be assimilated by the nervous system and can expand into creative acts, like the imagery that the being invents according to a law of development. It has roots in experience, but would not exist without a self-constituting activity. Learning does not differ from genesis profoundly, but learning is a genesis that requires a very complex somatic formation. The individual is what it is in accordance with this activity of amplifying transfer, which is an active genesis and not a genesis that is passively undergone. Degrees of individuality are relative to the density of this activity. This criterion alone is fundamental, i.e., the exercise of an amplifying and transductive activity. If this activity is distributed between the whole of a colony and the parts of this colony, it should be said that the parts are incomplete individuals, yet the whole should not be considered an organism whose individuals would be nothing but organs. Indeed, these incomplete individuals are increasingly incomplete the more dependent on one another and virtually less detachable they are. However, it can be noted that in morphology, the interdependence of incomplete individuals is marked by the importance of the functions of the shared relations that belong to the whole. If this relation between the parts of the whole is only nutritive, the individuality of the parts can still be considered noteworthy. For these individuals, the fact of taking in the same interior milieu establishes a bond between them, but this bond nevertheless leaves behind a certain independence. I'll stop here because this is a page-long paragraph, so let's pause for discussion. So he begins by raising this question, which is a sort of pseudo question. As he says here, we can only answer it by recasting our commonplace concepts. So the question, in the case of this colonial budding, like in sponges or these various worms and other organisms that he's been discussing, in this case, is there simply growth of one individual? Like, does the colony as a whole constitute one individual that just grows through budding? Or is there the birth or the coming into existence of distinct individuals, even though they're connected to each other? And this is a sort of false problem, or it's if it's understood in sort of the general terms of individuation, as we sort of commonly understand it, then it's not really a question you can solve. Whichever answer you give, whether you say yes, these are distinct individuals, or no, these are parts of one individual, either way, it sort of doesn't work properly. Like if you say that the various sponges are individuals, then the fact that they share a circulatory system contradicts that individuality. And then again, if you say that the whole sponge colony is one individual, then the fact that each sponge has its own nutritive apparatus, so like the pores that take in water and filter out, I guess, plankton or whatever the sponge lives off of. Those pores are separate to each distinct sub portion or quasi individual within the sponge colony. So either way, whichever option you pick, you can always find something that contradicts that general position. Really, there's no sort of yes or no answer to whether this organism that you're looking at is an individual or not. There are degrees of individuation that correspond to the process of individuation, or the genesis of individuation. So we can only ever ascribe individuality to an organism or to an entity in general, insofar as it's part of a process of individuation, and trying to sort of look at the already constituted individual and see, what criteria does it meet? Can you sort of check off a box of properties that would make it consistent, or that would make it compatible with ascribing individuality to it? So trying to do that is never going to give you a clear answer in these cases where you have these organisms that live in colony forms and share various functions with each other. And I think an important point here as well is that in individuation, the individuated being is an agent and the result of the process. So the process of individuation is a sort of auto-individuation or self-individuation. There's organisms or entities, they undergo individuation and they result from that process of individuation, but at the same time, they're the ones that are affecting the individuation process and bringing it about. So there's the sort of dual role of the individual as both the result and as the agent of the process. And then he also points to a different sort of duality in the individual, which a duality with respect to what precedes the individual and what comes after the individual. So the individual is the result of a process of formation or of genesis, and so it has the characteristics of a product or of something that results from a process. But it also serves as the germ or the initiating condition for a new process of development and formation. So, like here, he's thinking of the organisms that have been discussed a couple of times, where they have both a colony form and an individual form, where the individual form separates off from a colony and has an independent existence and has the property of mobility in a way that the colony doesn't. So it moves around, and then finally it finds a resting place of some kind. It anchors itself to the seafloor, and then it undergoes budding and forms a new colony. So the individual has this role of amplifying reproduction, so the capacity to produce new individuals in a way that the colony form does not have. And then there's this bit on learning. So learning is, so as Simondon described it here, is that learning is not sort of fundamentally distinct from genesis. So there's no sort of firm distinction between the original coming into existence of an entity, and in this case, an organism, and the process of learning. Learning is a part of the development of the organism, or there's a continuity from development to what we would describe as learning. But learning presupposes a fairly complicated organism, So there has to be a nervous system that is capable of undergoing change and storing those changes in some form. I think maybe he, based on just the state of biological knowledge at that time, he might have sort of overestimated the degree of complexity that's required for learning, because I know there have been some experiments in the last few years where worms of some kind were able to learn, like to display acquired adaptation to an experimental setup of some kind. So worms are fairly simple organisms in terms of their nervous system. Like they have a few hundred neurons or a few thousand maybe, but they're still able to display learning in a particular experimental setup. So there's some sort of learning capability, obviously fairly limited, but still it's present in these relatively simple organisms. So I think that even strengthens the point that Simondon was making about the continuity between development and learning, and so we should understand learning as being sort of a process of individuation in the organism that is undergoing the learning experience. So there's rather than seeing learning as something that happens to an organism that's already completely constituted, we should see it as something that is bringing about a further individuation process in the organism.
So I'd like to ask you like to double check my understanding. I'm not sure like if I fully understand the content. So connecting to the previous part, particularly in the previous part, like as you explained, like it mostly focused on particular schema of the colony. What I understood about the part is it seemed to try explicate how like ramify, or how to colony itself, how to like produce, how to generate something new, in what structure, in what schema it could be possible. In connection to that idea, Simondon tries to go further to individual. What I understand individual is like it comes a little bit later, as far as I read, which has a kind of center which can control the process. The process here means like individuation. It's like individuation is the process and at the same time acting. And then individual is like which can control kind of the whole process by using the process of individuation. Like you can talk more about information, whatever, things like that. So my question is that connecting to the previous part, like the reason why like Simondon talk about sponge or a colony and so on, things like that, like using biological terms and here and there, he tried to like show how individuation could take place, occur in nature, in what kind of structure, in what kind of so-called schema. And then individual is like a one form. I mean, not that it could be colony, but individual is like a little bit independence being, like independent from the colony, which can control its process of individuation. Am I right, or is there anything I should correct myself?
I think that the big picture is correct. We'll get to the bit about information and control of the process of individuation in a couple pages. So maybe we'll keep that discussion for that point in a little bit. in terms of the connection with the previous chapter, the previous chapter that we saw last time. Yeah, so in that chapter, he had looked at this ramification or this branching growth in colonies of organisms, and he looked at the degree or whether we can ascribe individuality to the colony as a whole. So whether the colony is something that is describable as an individual, and we saw that there are different degrees of individuality for different organisms, depending on how much structure the colony imposes on its members or subcomponents or whatever. And then in this chapter, he's turning the focus onto the actual individual that makes up the colony, and trying to analyze the structure of that individuation process. So rather than looking at the individual as something constituted and sort of checking whether it meets certain criteria of individuality, what we're doing instead is looking at the process of individuation as a genesis of the individual, and then trying to look at the degree of individuation or a degree of individuality, I should say, that corresponds to that process. And we'll see, as you mentioned in a few pages, about this idea of integration of information as being one of the key components of that process of individuation.
Yeah, by listening to you, my question a little bit more specific. Later, we are going to discuss collective individuation. I mean, compared to psychic individuation. As far as I understand, that here colony is was brought up to just to show how individuation can be more in terms of a quantity, I guess. If individual constitutes colony, then that's a different story. It is more connected to the collectivity. What I understand is a colony is just brought up in biology or in nature to show how some kind of a biological part shows the process of individuation, but the colony itself cannot be said individual. Some of them can be called individual, but some of them not. Something like that. That's my understanding. If individual is a part of a colony, then that's a different story.
I think I would not want to sort of identify this colony form with collective individuation as it comes up in the later parts of this book. So we saw, I think at the beginning of this part, he gives a sort of preview of what's coming in the rest of the book, and he distinguishes between what he calls a society in a sort of strict sense, or in a specific sense that he wants to use the term. He distinguishes between a society and then inter-individual relations, and then collective individuation is something distinct from either of those. So a society is some sort of grouping of individuals in which each individual has some sort of specific function, or there's a differentiation of individuals into those specific functions or roles. And so the sort of classic example of this is a beehive, where each individual has a specific role, and there's even morphological adaptation to those roles, like a worker bee and a queen bee have different morphology and physiology. So there's a society because it has these differentiated roles. I think this lines up more closely with these colony forms of organisms. So the colony form is sort of an intermediate between a society and an individual, or it sort of participates in the properties of a society and of an individual. whereas collective individuation is, well, we'll see in more detail when we get to it, but it involves something common to all individuals rather than differentiating individuals according to their roles within the society. So there's in the formation of a collective individual, there's the genesis of something common to all the individuals rather than a differentiation of those individuals into specific roles. And so I think because of that, we shouldn't identify the colony form of the organism with collective individuation.
Yeah, true. So you think like an individual constitutes a colony?
Well, I would say that for these organisms that have the colony form, the colony is a sort of intermediate between an individual and a society, and so there's it. I think Simono even says this somewhere that you can't distinguish between individual and society in organisms like sponges. So there's a sort of undecidability, I guess, with respect to what level of aggregation we should describe as being the individual in the case of sponges. So there's so whether an individual and a society are two distinct levels of analysis depends on the type of organism, and in the case of sponges, they coincide.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so I think we should probably move on to the next bit, just so we don't get sort of stuck on this first part. So would someone else like to read from the top of 210?
On the contrary, if nerve fibers link the different parts to one another, the functionality of these different parts is bound by a much stricter interdependence. A strict functional bond exists with the community of information. The individuality of the parts becomes very weak. What needs to be introduced to determine the degree of individuality is therefore not the morphological criterion alone, but the morphological criterion and the functional criterion. For example, as Rabot indicates, the cells of an organism like a metazoan are defined by well-determined contours, but they are nevertheless not individuals, since each of them only functions under the direct, constant, and unavoidable influence of its neighbors. Each cell involves very strict rapport of dependence with the others, such that its functional activity is nothing but an element of the functional activity of the whole. This loss of functional individuality produces a very low level of individuality. Thus, independent of any genesis, individuality can be presented as characterized by functional autonomy. But this is only true if the word autonomy is given its full meaning. Self-regulation, the state of obeying nothing but its own law and developing according to its own structure. This criterion coincides with hereditary substantiality. Beings are autonomous when they themselves regulate their own developments and store information and regulate their action themselves by means of this information. The individual is the being that can conserve or increase the content of information. It is the autonomous being in terms of information, since information is what grants it veritable autonomy. If individuals that were bound together by a xenosarc had nothing in common but nourishment, they would still be called individuals, could still be called individuals. But if chemical messages pass with this nourishment from one individual to another, and consequently if there is a state of the whole that regulates the different parts, then the autonomy of information becomes very weak in each part, and individuality lowers correlatively. What needs to be studied is the regime of information in a being in order to know what the degree of individuality of the parts with respect to the whole is. The individual is characterized as the unit of a system of information. When one point of the ensemble receives an excitation, this information will be reflected in the organism and will come back in the form of a more or less generalized motor or secretory reflex. This reflection of information sometimes takes place in the same part in which the excitation occurs or in a part that constitutes with it the same organic unity. But this reflex is nevertheless made dependent upon a center if the whole is individualized. This center creates facilitation or inhibition. In this case, there is a center in which the individual stores past information and by means of which it commands, monitors, inhibits, or facilitates, in the English way of speaking, controls the passage from a centripetal information to a centrifugal reaction. Jesus. What defines individuality is the existence of this center by means of which the being regulates itself and modulates its milieu. The stronger the center's control, the more individualized the whole, and the less the parts can be considered autonomous individuals. A regime of fragmentary information reveals a weak individualization of the whole. In animals whose parts are quite differentiated, such as mammals, the regime of information is very centralized. The information received by any one part of the body immediately reverberates throughout the central nervous system, and all the parts of the body respond in a short enough time with an appropriate action, at least those that depend directly on the central nervous system. In animals that have a poorly centralized nervous system, the relation is established between the different parts more slowly. There is a unity of the system of information, but its speed sharply decreases. We can obtain a notion of this less coherent, less rigorously unified individuality by analyzing what our individuality would be if we only had sympathetic and parasympathetic systems. A unity of information would remain, but the reactions would remain slower, more diffuse, and less perfectly unified. The difference is so great between the two regimes of information that we are sometimes hard-pressed to make coincide within us the reverberation of an information in the central nervous system with its reverberation in the sympathetic system. And this difficulty can sometimes veer towards splitting, as if individuality were indeed defined by a regime of information. A being that would have two totally independent regimes of information would have two individualities. What complicates the problem in the case of colonies of metazoans is the fact that every alimentary relation is also a chemical relation, and that the importance of chemical messages is greater in proportion to how elementary the being is. This chemical sensitivity is what forms the unity and guarantees the individuality of a plant, allowing for the self-regulation of exchanges in accordance with its needs. The opening and closing of pores, perspiration, and the movements of the sap, as those of Sir Bose have shown. We can therefore suppose that in the animal the existence of a community of chemical information lowers the level of individuality of the parts, but nevertheless leaves a certain individuality intact. In sum, the regime of information is what defines the degree of individuality. In order to appreciate it, we must establish a rapport between the propagation of the speed of information and the duration of the act or event to which the information is relative. This section seems relatively clear to me in comparison to some of the recent sections in the book. It makes sense that the degree of individuality has to do with the propagation speed of information, as for instance they're through a central nervous system.
Yeah, and so what sort of the role that a central nervous system plays in an organism is basically to speed up the connection from one part to another. Whereas in, say, a sponge colony, it takes several seconds for a chemical signal to diffuse throughout the body of the whole colony, or from one sponge to a sponge on the other side of the colony. In the case of an organism that has a nervous system, it means that the reaction can take place in a fraction of a second. From you can have an excitation of an antenna or something on one end of the organism that produces a response at the other end of the organism within a fraction of a second. And so this just means that the organism forms an integrated whole with respect to events or environmental impacts of a much shorter duration. Whereas in the case of the colony of sponges, it's only with respect to relatively long or relatively slow environmental influences that the whole colony forms something like an individual. in relation to a relatively localized and relatively quick event, like, I don't know, being touched, like a tactile impact on one portion of the colony. There might be a local reaction, but it doesn't have any effect on the rest of the colony. Yeah, the role of the nervous system is effectively to integrate with respect to time for the organism to respond to environmental influences. And there's this interesting point here where he talks about how if there were some sort of gap or lack of coordination between say our nervous system and our endocrine system, for example, and so that you would have a different set of reactions, like your actual nervous system and its connection with sensory organs and motor organs would have one sort of set of reactions to a situation or an event, and then your endocrine system, which circulates hormones in your body, would have a completely different reaction. If this were sort of a generalized condition, then you would, to some extent, you would have to say that there are two different individualities in your body, or your body constitutes two distinct individualities. We can, of course, there is a certain degree of independence between the endocrine system and the nervous system. So, like, for example, you can there can be a situation where you sort of rationally recognize that something is not a danger, for example, but you still have your endocrine system is still circulating adrenaline in your body, and you still feel that sort of tension or that reaction of fear in relation to the situation. So you can have a sort of disconnect between your nervous system and your endocrine system, but this is a sort of exceptional situation. It's not the sort of generalized condition of the relationship between those two systems.
I thought the connection between individuality and self-regulation was interesting, and I guess I'm curious whether this will hold for psychic individuation as well, and kind of the relationship between the idea of, he says the individual obeying nothing but its own law, and I was reading learning a little bit about Freud recently, and the sort of, obviously, the importance of kind of the submission to the law in the development of a, functioning ego or kind of stable psychic structure. And I think, like, in Freudian terms, it seems like something that obeyed nothing but its own law would be, it sounds like the structure of like a psychotic psyche. I don't know how this idea of total self-regulation is played out at the psychic level, and what its relationship to the collective is.
Yeah, that's a good question. So he has already talked about this distinction between two sets of functions in vital individuation, or in relation to living organisms. So that distinction between the colony form and the individual form of the organism, he also described it as a relationship between, or a distinction between, the sort of social instincts and the drives that have to do with individuation. And he criticized Freud, or he thought that Freud sort of overemphasized the sort of conflict between the two, or the way that Freud always presents he focuses on drives to the exclusion of social instincts. So he understands the relationship between the individual and society as one of repression fundamentally. So the individual has to repress instinctive responses that are counter-social in order to be incorporated into society as a sort of functioning member of society. And so Simondon argues that we need to, at the same time, as like in addition to the drives, we have to at the same time look at these social instincts. We can see that in instinctive behavior, there isn't anything like this conflict between the individual and society, because the instincts, these social instincts are satisfied through social interaction rather than sort of in opposition to social interaction or social regulation or something like that. In relation to this bit on autonomy, I think Simondon would argue that the social integration or the sort of functions of social interaction are part of the autonomy of an individual. So an individual realizes itself or obeys its own law insofar as it develops as a social organism and as a part of a society, rather than sort of in opposition to a society that is something that is imposed from outside. I think that's how he would sort of understand that he would want to get away from the idea of a sort of essential conflict between social structure or social integration and the individual's autonomy or something like that.
Okay, thanks. That's really helpful. So it would, to some degree, the individual would self-regulate towards social integration.
Yeah, I think that's right. So the social, like if we understand human beings as social animals or social organisms, then part of what it is for an individual human being to realize itself or to regulate itself in accordance with its own law is to precisely integrate itself into a society, and that is not in conflict with the autonomy or the self-regulating development of a human individual. And then maybe sort of the counter sides to that is that as we've discussed earlier, the collective individuation is something distinct from integration into a society. So there's more. It's more complicated than just the purely sort of social instincts integrating into a society, because the collective individuation introduces like a different layer of individuation rather than sort of integrating individuals into a society. There's a new form of individuation in collective individuation, but we'll get to that eventually.
I agree. That, like just what my question maybe like I can get some answers from all of you like after reading next part, because like discussion about the information continues. My question is about information. When I self-studied the Simondon, like the identity of information always like confused me. I tried to connect Simondon's idea to identity negotiation. So I wanted to like reveal like what information here means, and then how it works and how it functions, something like that. At the end of the day, I thought like information maybe like equal to event as a stimulus of external environments, something like that. Maybe next part like act and event is also mentioned, but still it's still confusing like what exactly information means here. So after reading next part, maybe hopefully like we can talk about the identity, the nature, the identity of information is.
Yeah, that's another good question too. Let's read the next page or so, and then come back to that question on what information means. Because I mean that's one of the key concepts of this whole book. So it's important to try to understand what he means when he talks about information. So I'll read the next page, and then we'll stop for discussion, because this is, again, one of these multi-page paragraphs. Therefore, if the duration of information propagation is small relative to the duration of the act or event, an important region of the being, indeed the whole being, will have to take on attitudes and carry out the modifications suitable for this act. In the contrary case, the event or act will remain a local reality, even if there is a reverberation for the whole colony afterwards. Individuality is marked with respect to a type of act or event determined by the possibility of reaction and thus of control of the usage of information in accordance with the state of the organism, and consequently the possibility of autonomy. The autonomous zone, i.e. the zone in which information has the time to propagate in a centripetal direction and then in a centrifugal direction, quickly enough for the self-regulation of the act to be able to take place effectively, is the zone that belongs to the same individuality. What marks the limits of individuality is the recurrence of centripetal and then centrifugal information. This limit is functional by nature, but it can be anatomical, for anatomical limits can impose a critical delay to information. This criterion applies to colonies. A colony whose parts are linked only by circulatory pathways has no means other than chemical means to convey information. Chemical messages propagate either through convection, and the speed then depends on the speed of the currents, generally several centimeters per second, or through the diffusion of molecules in liquid. This diffusion depends on the temperature in the bodies present, but it is fairly slow, almost at the same order of magnitude as the speed of convection. In small organisms, this mode of information transmission can be quite fast. In organisms of several centimeters, it becomes quite slow. Therefore, the majority of the acts of defense and capture can only receive a self-regulation, the basis of autonomy, if information is conveyed by the nerves, within which the conduction speed of nervous impulses is generally several meters per second, and thus around 5 times faster than conduction by chemical means. Practically, for the life acts of relation in animals, the limits of the individual are also the limits of the nervous system. Yet it must always be specified that it is only for the life acts of relation that this individuality is limited by the nervous system. Certain other activities can require reactions slow enough such that the colony then behaves as an individual. This is the case, for example, when a toxic substance gets captured by an individualized part of a colony. This capture merely involves a local process, for example, a reflex of contraction or relaxation when the toxic body has excited the individualized part. But after several seconds, the chemical messages produce a global reaction of the whole colony that interrupts or reverses the movement of water pumping or retracts all the hydrants without any contact with the toxin having taken place, except in the part in which the capture reflex occurred. In this case, it will have to be said that the colony is an individual in terms of alimentation, but a society for the other functions. Individuality is essentially linked to the regime of information for each subset of vital activities. And so Angus has posted a footnote here, which I think is a footnote from the translator, not one of Simon Noel's footnotes, but it's so a centripetal information signal is a type of signal that involves the sense organs. So this is a signal that passes from the periphery of the organism to the center. And a centrifugal signal is one that incites a reaction, a posture, or a gesture. So this is a signal that originates in the center and passes to the periphery. And so I think that's connected to your question about information and what exactly it means here. So the sort of basic meaning of information has to do with signals, and Simon Noel studied information theory, the mathematical theory of signaling and the information conveyed by signals. He studied that very closely, and the sort of general principle of communication theory or information theory is that the signal can convey information insofar as it's correlated with the variation of the source. So if the source has like if in the case of like the simplest case is a coin flip or something like that, where there are two discrete states of the source, and the the signal, in order to be able to transmit the information about whether the coin is heads or tails, the signal has to have two discrete states that can correspond to heads or tails in the coin. And so, in general, you have to be able, in order for a signal to transmit information, it has to have at least as many states as at least as many possible states as the source does, and so this is sort of the basic notion of information that Simondon is starting from. But we read a few months ago now, before we started the Individuation book, we read Simondon's text, Form, Information, and Potentials, which is included as a in the second volume as an appendix to this book. And in that book, Simondon argues that the transmission notion of information, or the theory of communication, is sort of secondary to a more fundamental notion of information, which is has to do with the generation of the source message in the first place. So he he brings up the example of, in the case of television communication, for example, if you take like a bucket of sand or something like that, and you dump it onto a table, and then you want to transmit the information about each grain of sand, the location of each grain of sand on the table, that takes a huge amount of information to transmit, even though, of course, the actual content of that message, or the actual situation being transmitted, is very unstructured. Like, you've just dumped a bunch of sand on the table. There's no real structure to that situation. And then, by contrast, if you take, say, a picture of a rectangle or a picture of a square, and you want to transmit that picture, you can transmit it much more efficiently by just specifying it's a square of so many centimeters across, and it's this far from each of the edges, and so you just transmit a very small amount of information, and then the person at the other end can reconstruct the square based on that very small amount of information. So the signal transmitting the square, the picture of the square, actually has much less information in the sense of information theory than the picture that transmits the bucket of sand dumped on a table. But there's there's something sort of counterintuitive about this idea that there's more information in this just random collection of sand particles on a table compared to a square. And so Simondon argues that this transmission notion of information is secondary to the notion of the generation of the message in the first place, and that has to do with the capacity to structure other situations in the future. So the square has a much higher information content, in the sense that it can serve to structure someone else's perception after transmission, or it has the role of a structural germ in future perceptual processes, in a way that the pile of sand on a table does not, because it's sort of structureless. Sorry, that's a sort of a long answer, but the sort of short version is that information has this basic meaning of the content transmitted by a message, but it also has, for Simondon, this more fundamental meaning of this capacity to structure an environment in some determinate way.
That's a quite interesting explanation. And then particularly in tele example, it makes me think that that's why like Simondong's theory is quite popular nowadays, like in relation to artificial intelligence and then technical objects, things like that. The interesting point is that information in that sense, like as explained so far in the book, like it seems like a presuppose like there is particular structure. I mean, structure of organs or anything else. I mean, schema already like there, and then contents are coming in, and then in the process of individuation, like some transductive process whatsoever, as you just explained, like it can be regenerated, or it can just transmit information. So-called information can be transmitted, or it can regenerate something new. Yeah, that's perfect. The point that I was confused is that one. Like I thought that information. I understood information in relation to synapse, biological synapse diagram, like neuron in the synapse. I mean, that theory. So, if there is a stimulus from outside, and then it will get and then synapse to like transmit that information to the other neuron, something like that. It goes around things like that. I was wondering, information is like something like a stimulus, but according to your explanation, it's more like a how do I say it? Like a content which is like transmitted in the process, which can be generated something new. That is called the information, not that just like only a stimulus from outside. Like information has to do with maybe like if I say now like transductive process, not just like a stimulus from outside.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think if we look at sort of a bare stimulus or just some sort of impact from the environment onto an organism, that stimulus only conveys information insofar as it has some effect on the organism. So, like for example, human beings can't perceive ultraviolet radiation. So shining an ultraviolet radiation on a human, it doesn't convey any information, even though it does have some sort of causal impact on the person, like in producing skin cancer eventually down the line. So it's only insofar as the organism has some capacity to be structured by that stimulus, that the stimulus actually conveys information to that organism. So in the case of the square, so perceiving a square through visual perception, it has a high information content in the sort of original sense of information, or this primary sense of information that Simondon identifies, because that square can serve as the basis for a structuration of the perceptual situation for many people, or over many different environments, or something like that. And so it's only when the organism is capable of receiving that information and then responding to it in some way by either changing its structure or performing an action of some kind, some sort of response in general, it's only in that situation that the organism is actually capable of receiving information from a stimulus. Otherwise, what we would describe as a stimulus is just some sort of causal impact on the organism, but not conveying information.
I hope I can also like figure out my other question related to like a capacity or potential, and then the amount of information in terms of apparently predestined structure, like how much information is enough for a particular structure, or to what extent the information working to make something possible. I mean, that comes to my mind because I thought that Simondong's theory is related to ontogenesis. Ontogenesis gives me impression of like a limitless, like a genesis, like something new can be generated forever in that. But maybe I might be wrong because I mean, reading so far, it's kind of like there is structured like a schema, and then information comes to particular individual, and there might be some kind of like a limit of capacity. I'm not sure about this part, and then maybe like the next part would helpful to understand this one.
I think what I would say is that the sort of ontogenetic aspect of Simondon's theory, or this capacity for invention and creation of something new, is always relative to an existing structure, as you mentioned. But I don't think he would want to regard that as a limitation as such. There's something like there has to be some sort of initial structuration already, or there has to be some sort of structure to begin with for a new process of individuation to sort of get off the ground. So in the case of like the crystal example that we saw in the first part of the book, there's already a molecular structure, even in the case of the solution that you start with, and then it's just that structure is at a very low order of magnitude, or very low scale. And the crystallization, it doesn't so much create a structure out of nothing. It instead reorganizes the structure that already exists, and so it produces a structure at a different order of magnitude than had previously existed. And it's the same thing in the case of organisms. So there's already some sort of structure that has to exist in order for a new structure to be able to appear, which will be at a different order of magnitude with respect to space or to time, or in the case of learning, for example, an organism is capable of discovering a temporal structure, so the organism can learn that whenever the bell rings, food appears. So they learn this temporal structure of events, so but that capacity builds on the existing, or restructures the existing capacity to hear the sound of the bell, and to see the presence of food, for example. The organism has to have those two capacities already in order for it to be able to learn that the bell ringing means food will appear. I think the sort of inventive side, or the creation of something new, is always a restructuring of an existing structure, rather than the creation of a structure out of nothing.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. That's what we're here for, is discussion. So yeah, that's a good question, because one sort of difficulty with that account, as I just presented it, is that the question arises of how structure appears in the first place, or what is the basis of structure as such. So you can sort of go back from one level to another. You can say that the structure that appears, the crystallization, the crystal structure, is a restructuring of the pre-existing molecular structure, and so on. You can sort of go back from one level to another, and sort of push the problem back one level. But then the question of where structure appears from in the first place is not addressed, so you either have to, I think, just accept that structure is sort of eternal, that it's sort of structure. There's always some sort of structure. There's no such thing as a structureless situation. And I think that's Bergson's answer to this type of problem. And he argues that there's a sort of false presupposition that there is such a thing as a structureless situation that would precede structure.
So does it have to do like Simona was a student of Ganglem and then Merleau-Ponty, right? And then they are related to physiological metabolism, something like that. If going back to like Aristotle, like thinking about form and matter, can we say that like Simona was affected by like halomorphism? Halomorphism, is that right pronunciation? Like like the theory of form and matter. So based on that idea, maybe he might think that there must be some kind of like structure, existing structure, and then he just brings that idea like without any thought.
I would say that so Simondon criticizes the hylomorphic theory at the beginning of the book, in the introduction, and then again in the first chapter, where we look at the example of the brick, the formation of a brick. So he argues that the hylomorphic theory doesn't account for the interaction of form and matter. So there's this obscure zone between form and matter that is not explained in the hylomorphic theory, and it's that obscure zone or that interaction between form and matter is what he is sort of trying to explain. Yeah, I think he would not want to sort of base his account of structure on a hylomorphic picture of the relationship between form and matter. And I think the account of the appearance of structure at a higher level through restructuring of lower level structure, I think that account is supposed to be an alternative to the hylomorphic theory rather than presupposing the hylomorphic theory. For Simondon, we have to understand matter always as being structured matter, I think. But then at the same time, he wants to see structure as always being relative to something unstructured. The pre-individual is sort of precedes structure, and then after the process of individuation, the milieu retains that lack of structure, or that formlessness, we could say, from the pre-individual milieu. So there's a sort of complementarity, I guess we could say, between structure and the pre-individual, which is formless or unstructured. But yeah, that's a difficult question, I think, for Simondon.
So is that metastable phase like in the process of individuation?
So the metastability, I think, comes in at a different point of the picture. So it's metastability is the name for the basic concept of metastability is a relative stability that is not a final stability in the sense of depletion of potentials. So metastability is a state that is stable for a certain time period, but in which there is still potential for further transformation to occur. So there's the concept of metastability is related to the concept of potential energy and the capacity for a system to undergo transformation.
But at the same time, that means also like a fixity and then unfixity. I mean, or infixity of in terms of a form and matter. I mean, if what you say like potential, and then that has to do also information, like how it is transformed, and then metastable phases like as you said, like there is an obscure sphere between fixed form and the matter, and maybe like that area in a way indicates like what Simon wants to figure out.
Yeah, I think so. Sorry, yeah. So Angus has suggested that we should probably wrap up this discussion so we can keep continuing with the reading for today. So I'll just sort of wrap up by saying that yeah, there's this relationship between form or structure and the pre-individual that precedes form and structure, and information is the capacity of form to bring about a transformation of structure and the creation of a new structure. So information in the sort of more fundamental sense that Simondon introduces. So yeah, we always have to think when we think of information, we have to always think of it in connection with the potential for transformation, which is sort of the other side of the notion of information.
Yeah, thank you so much. So sorry, and then so sorry to continue saying, and then thank you so much.
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, we're here to discuss, but I do think it's probably best to move on for today. So we're at the top of. Sorry, no, that's where we were. That's where we started last time. I think we're at 213.
Okay. Due to this criterion, we can see individuality establish itself progressively. In nadomorph oligochaetes, the new parts, which remain attached to their founder for quite a while, take on the appearance of a complete worm, while budding continues and other parts differentiate, such that it forms a chain of zooids. The new cerebral ganglion is grafted onto the sections of the pre-existing ventral chain. The nervous system forms a continuous whole along the chain that includes several heads with their respective ganglia. In the same way, the new intestinal tube is inserted into the old parts. The physiological activity is perfectly coordinated. Only the intestinal tube of the founder functions. All the movements of the individual are perfectly linked together. The peristaltic waves of the intestines regularly propagate back and forth without discontinuity. The circulation mutually belongs to the whole file. The bristles over the whole ensemble are animated by synchronous oscillations. Consequently, we can see that this ensemble of zooids includes nothing but a single zone of autonomy, coextensive with the nervous system. This ensemble is therefore a single individual. On the contrary, when the anatomical links that bind parts begin to dissolve, the tissues enter into histolysis, following the same line in which the nervous system of the founder is welded to the new cerebral ganglions. Muscular coordination then breaks down little by little. The contractions become incongruous, and the incongruities accelerate the separation. It can therefore be said that each zooid would already possess its own individuality before the separation, with its functional autonomy, in particular, its nervous autonomy. Here, individuality is not created by the anatomical separation. It is from the start individuality that appears as the independence of the regime of information and accelerates the separation when the movements are put into disarray. It is interesting to note that the nervous and circulatory connections would still partially exist at the moment in which the contractions would already become antagonistic. Thus, independence, even the independence of the neural pathways, is not what creates individuality. Instead, individuality is created by the regime of information conditioned by these pathways. It's because the zooid's nervous system is developed enough to have its own rhythmic activity and to inhibit the nervous impulses coming from the nervous system of the founder that individualization can be continued. The mark and foundation of individualization in the nervous system of the zooid is the recurrent regime of information signals. A certain individualization is required in order for this recurrence to be possible. But as soon as it is possible, this recurrence is established and accelerates individualization. The zooid's individualization can be dated the moment that it can inhibit the nervous messages coming from its parent. Let's note that a cyclical activity like that of oscillation is the very type of nervous functionality that can be produced by the recurrence of signals in an element of the nervous system or in a completely different network in which signals propagate. Anatomical independence is therefore indeed far from constituting the criterion of individuality. What constitutes the criterion of individuality is independence, or better yet, functional autonomy. In fact, autonomy is not synonymous with independence. Autonomy exists before independence, since autonomy is the possibility of functioning according to a process of internal resonance that can be inhibitory with regard to the messages received from the rest of the colony and that can create independence. The independence of individuals with respect to one another is moreover rare and almost impossible. Even when individuals have no anatomical bond between one another, they undergo the influence of the milieu that surrounds them. And among these influences, there are those originating from the other individuals, which are components of the milieu. Each individual determines the reactions of the neighboring individual to a certain extent. This interaction, which is ongoing and unavoidable, establishes a certain rapport, but the individuals remain autonomous. There's no functional coordination among them. Information does not pass from one individual to the other. The zone of the conservation and recurrence of information is limited to individuals. Whatever the intensity of reciprocal action may be, each individual reacts in its own way, sooner or later, more slowly or more quickly, for longer or more briefly. In order for information to pass from one individual to another, the centripetal information signals that have detached from the centrifugal information signals within an individual would have to be received as centrifugal by the other individuals. However, any information that emanates from an individual is received as centripetal by another individual, which responds to this information via its own centrifugal reaction. In order for the interaction to become communication, one of the individuals would have to govern the others, i.e., the others would have to lose their autonomy, and centrifugal information signals emanating from one individual would have to remain centrifugal within the individuals that receive them. This organization, which implies that one individual becomes a leader, does not seem to exist in colonies. So I understand this point he's making in that first paragraph about the priority of information rather than sort of anatomical connection, for instance, in a nervous system, which can still exist, where in situations where like information, the regime of information changes so that there's individuation, even though there's the same nervous system.
Yeah, and we can even see this in like certain neurological disorders where different parts of the body have different systems or are not integrated properly into the total system of information of the organism. So that like there are I can't remember the name of the disorder, but there's certain disorders which interfere with the sort of integration of information from the two hemispheres of the brain, so that you effectively have the left and right hemispheres acting more or less independently of each other. And so you can even, like, there are sort of elaborate psychological experiments you can set up where you can ask a question of a person who is suffering from this disorder, and you can get the left and right sides of the brain to respond separately. Like you ask them to write something with their left hand, which is controlled by the right side of the brain, and then you ask them to point at something with their right hand, which is controlled by the left side of the brain, and the messages that the left and right side of the brain are their responses to the question will be different. They won't match up with each other. So there's even though anatomically there might be the connection might still be there between the left and right sides of the brain, they aren't integrated with each other into a single regime of information. Yeah, and Angus has also posted a question in the chat asking if multiple sclerosis involves this kind of fragmentation of regimes of information. I'm not really sure. I'm not super familiar with how MS works. I think there is something like this sort of fragmentation in the sense that portions of the body stop being integrated into a system of information, so that you're no longer capable of receiving information from that portion of the body and then retransmitting a signal to that portion of the body. Yeah, so it does seem like there's some sort of role of information fragmentation or a breakdown of transmission of signals is part of what constitutes MS. But yeah, I'm not super familiar with how it works exactly. But I think the case of these worms is interesting because we see that the individuality of the so the worms they sort of form this chain of zooids or of sort of not fully distinguished individuals, and for a while they're integrated in terms of. Oh, sorry, Ollie, could you? Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so for the first bit, they're integrated with each other in terms of their regime of information. So they have like the movement of the intestinal walls is synchronized across the whole chain of these zooids. And I think he mentions also the cilia, the hairs that are also synchronized across the multiple zooids. But then after a while, the synchronization breaks down so that individual zooids now form their own separate regimes of information, and this asynchronous or unsynchronized movement is actually what brings about the separation. So that brings about the anatomical separation. So the anatomical separation is not the basis of individuality, but it actually brings about the anatomical separation is brought about by the informational separation of the individual zooids. So I thought that was pretty interesting because we tend to sort of like our default concept of individuation would make anatomical separation sort of the main criterion for individuality. But here it's anatomical separation is a result of a more fundamental informational separation. So yeah, we have about 8 minutes left. So I'll read the last page or so of this subsection. We might not have time to discuss it fully, but we can come back to anything that remains next time. When material obstacles persist and limit the displacement of individuals, functionally autonomous and anatomically distinct but materially interdependent organisms remain attached to the same support. They are nevertheless individuals. Even if they are attached to one another, they play the role of a substrate with respect to one another. In conclusion to the attempt at determining this functional criterion of individuality, it can be said that the hydrants of a colony of coelenterates possess the individuality of local and rapid reactions, such as contractions and movements of cilia. There is no nervous system that establishes a functional synchronization between the hydrants. In contrast, the individuality of the slow reactions belongs to the colony. Hydrants communicate with one another via the system of hollow canals in the sinus arc, canals that directly culminate in the various gastric cavities and thereby establish among the hydrants an obvious functional dependence. The products of the digestion and assimilation of hydrants flow into a sort of mutual circulation. Each hydranth is nourished by and also nourishes the ensemble of the others. In certain cases, the individuality of the parts of a colony can become temporarily complete. This is the case of millipores and hydrocorals. All the hydranths are unified by a system of interlinked canals in a rich hollow network within the calcareous mass. But since the hydranths do not stop expelling limestone, which accumulates around them, from time to time they dislodge from the bottom of the chamber, go back up towards its orifice, and lose all relation with the system of canals. But soon they again begin to proliferate and produce around them a series of buds linked together by a new system of canals. From then on, each hydranth becomes the center of a cenobium associated with other cenobia, each one originating from the complete yet fleeting individualization of hydranths detached from the older cenobia. In colonies of bryozoans, there can either be a simple juxtaposition of individuals or a circulatory unity of the ensemble, since each bryozoan lacks a heart. In colonies of tunicates and golden star tunicates, I believe, golden star tunicates, the individuality of the parts is complete, despite the existence of a shared cloaca in the golden star tunicates. In fact, the shared cloaca cannot regularly convey information. Before we get into this section that I just read, I forgot to mention one of the footnotes in the previous section that we read. So footnote 29 is, I think, an important one, and it's connected with the question that we were talking about in relation to information. So I'll just sort of translate it on the fly, unless someone else has it up and ready now. But so he says, this expression, signals of information, is employed in order to maintain the difference between information properly speaking, which is a way of being of a system that presupposes potentiality and heterogeneity, and the signals of information, called in general information, even though they are only an instrument which is not necessary, which is particularly developed when the parts forming a system are distant from one another, as is the case in a macroorganism or in a society. He points out these two different notions of information, and he uses he doesn't use this sort of consistently, but yeah, so he uses the term information signals for the what is generally called information in information theory or communication theory. And then he wants to reserve the term information for the more fundamental notion, which has to do with a system that contains potentiality and heterogeneity within it. But he again doesn't use that term consistently in that sense. So sometimes he talks about information in the sense of signals of information. But yeah, so going back to the part that we just read. Sorry, let me just skip ahead here. So yeah, there are the individuality of a group of organisms that form a colony is a relative individuality in the sense that it's only a certain degree of individuality rather than a either or sort of yes or no whether it's an individual or not. But it's also relative to specific functions, so that in the case of the colony of coelenterates, for example, he says that there are the organisms preserve some sort of individuality with respect to local and quick reactions, so reflexes of capturing food or evading prey or something like that are individualized, but the slower reactions, so chemical operations are shared across the whole organism, the whole colony of organisms. So there's the individuality with respect to slow reactions is found at the level of the colony rather than of the member of the colony. So there's a relativity of individuality to the specific functions. So certain functions can be individualized while others are at the level of the colony. Yeah, so I think we can end here for today. So we'll pick up from page 215, subsection 2. And yeah, so thanks everyone for questions and comments, and see you all next week.